Tim Jenkin, welcome. You're a political activist, you're a tech guru, you're an economist. Also, you could say you're a spy, fugitive, humanitarian. That's a lot to cover. And trust me, I've never done so much research for an interview before.
All
Um,
right.
you have your life is like it's like an octopus. It's just all these separate strands. So we're going to try and bring this together and find a kind of through line to the themes in your life. And I kind of wanted to start off with a wonderful quote I came across, which was, I'll try and do this justice. We would be removing from the face of the earth one of the most abominable scourges to be visited upon humankind. And it's just a very powerful statement. And yet, going back, you're born in Cape Town, 1948. You go to prep school. Your father's a doctor. Very respectable middle class existence. And you say yourself, you're just a middle class white kid who likes tinkering with bikes, you know. And yet at the same time, without stating the obvious, this is the apartheid era where segregation is becoming entrenched in law. We've got the ANC having its campaign of civil disobedience. You have obviously the Sharpeville massacre. You have the ANC forming a military wing and becoming banned as well. So the unrest is becoming very, very overt and visible. And I guess the really obvious question I have to ask is, how did that affect you?
Well, it was ongoing from the 1960s, and
Mm.
as a regular white South African, I took up the side of my peers. My parents. We all just thought, oh, well, this is, the blacks just rioting again. We can't understand it. That's just what they do. Nothing to do with apartheid. We'd never even heard of this concept before. They had their place and we had our place, and that's the way it's always been since the beginning of time. And maybe they just it's their nature to fight and to riot and so on. So in the beginning, it didn't. I took up the side, and that was my side, and we just condemned this thing, and eventually it sort of went away. But it started to rise again in the 1970s when I was at university. There were a lot of protests taking place. And you know what it's like when you're at university,
Yeah.
you're suddenly inspired about everything you're learning about how the world works, and your eyes are opened up. And then you actually witness these things yourself instead of reading about it in a newspaper. You see these things, and that's what happened. I went go and monitor what's going on, and I suffered from tear gas
Ah,
overpowerment,
yeah.
and then you suddenly realize, why are they throwing this stuff around? What are these people so upset about? And then I just started to read up about it. I didn't know anything about my country. It was at a time when we didn't really have many information sources. There was
Mm.
no internet. You couldn't do a search on Google. Overseas magazines and so on, they did arrive in South Africa, but they were usually a month out of date because they
Mm.
came on a ship. And all we had was the daily newspaper,
Mm.
which tended to support the government or pretend hostility towards them because they were of a political persuasion, but still on the white side. And then there was South African Broadcasting
Yeah.
Corporation, and television only arrived in South Africa in 1976. I think it was like the last country in the world.
Mm.
It's such a Puritan country. They said, no, we can't have this. It's the
Yeah.
devil's box.
Yeah. Very moral, very moral.
People watch the television. But, when you figured out, of course, they don't want you to watch television because then you start to find out what's going on in the world.
Well,
So, um,
that's something that intrigues me actually. Something you said about that. You actually enrolled in a social sciences degree at the University of Cape Town, and because you were becoming a bit more aware, you just were interested in your country, about how people live, how you can improve that, and you actually said the course books were claptrap. They were just nonsense about the blacks didn't live in these areas. This is why we can colonize it. And this wonderful reasoning that the white majority is actually the biggest minority because the black majority is lots and lots of little minorities. So if you count them as little minorities, we're the majority. And it's not exactly Thomas Paine's, rights of man. You know, it's just there's no sense to it.
That's what they did at the time. They were implementing this so-called Bantustan policy where they divided the country up into
Mm,
little pockets of tribal groupings and so on. And then some of them, they even said they were independent countries. Whether they were independent or not didn't make much difference. But anyway, they were just these ghettos where rural ghettos, as it were, with some puppet leaders who
mm,
were said to be the prime minister or the leader or chief or whatever. And yes, so exactly, the whites were the majority in the sense because each one of these groups were
mm.
smaller. And the white population in those days, I think, was about 20% anyway, gone down to something like 7 or 10% today. So that's how it was, and that's how they justified it.
But what?
And they were bringing to South Africa the civilization of the
Mhm.
rest of the world. These blacks were just living in mud huts and so on,
Yeah.
portrayed them as savages. So they
Uh,
needed to have the white man. They couldn't
yeah.
possibly run a modern society.
Well, the thing I find interesting is obviously we go to university and we all have our bit where we do power to the people. And then we leave university and we put on a collar and tie. That happens to most people. What's interesting about you is university, you start copying and disseminating banned literature, and that's with Stephen Lee. So that's already something that's placing you outside the law, putting you in danger. You're going one step further. And something I came across, which I thought was quite interesting, was that one day a canvasser from the Progressive Party came to your door, and he literally said, "You've got five choices in life." And it's like the movie with the seer at the crossroads, where the young man's going off on his epic journey, and then he says, "You have a choice," and it's. But he literally said, and if I can quote, "You can join the National Party. You can join the National Party. You can do nothing. You can emigrate. You can do something unconstitutional, or you can join the Progressive Party." And what I think is interesting is you chose do something unconstitutional. That's not many people would do that, however well-meaning they are.
Yes, not many people would do it, and not many people did do it in those days. The security police, the National Party machinery was very powerful, and it was essentially a police state. I even got stopped for riding through a traffic light on a bicycle. As today, people just ignore the lights even in cars.
Yeah.
So um, to do something unconstitutional was just unthinkable at that time.
Uh,
Um,
but it's a path that will put you outside the law and put you in danger. And
that's
that
correct.
that's the thing. A lot of people have that reflex, I'm not going to do that.
Yes,
You obviously thought of that and made that choice very early in life. And this is
yes,
something that will stay with you.
yes, correct.
And,
People have often asked me what made you take that path. And I actually find it quite difficult to explain. It's just the way I reacted to finding out about the situation, about the country that I was living in. It was like I'd grown up here and I had this completely false sense of how things worked. It was like I'd been living this lie. And it so shocked me. And I actually made an effort to go and find out, which most people didn't ever do. They just maybe read about these things and just say, oh, it's communist propaganda or ANC propaganda. It's not really as bad as that. Our blacks in South Africa are the best off in the whole of Africa. Look at the rest of Africa, it's a mess. And our guys are okay. We're looking after them. So that was the story. But when you go out there to look, and these places were always hidden,
yeah.
you could drive out of Cape Town on the motorway and you wouldn't see anything
mm,
because it would be all over the other side of the hill, as it were, sort of hidden away, and you couldn't physically get to these places. Get into a township, you had to have a permit.
mm.
And how do you get a permit if you've got no reason to go there?
Yeah.
You could get a permit, like if you're an engineer or you're going to, I don't know, install something in the area or open a shop. But otherwise, you couldn't get in there. So you didn't know about these things. You didn't read about them. And you just listened to the propaganda. So you thought everything was hunky dory and no reason to do
Mm.
anything about it.
Yeah. And you did
Once you find
something.
out,
Well, you
mm,
did something extraordinary, and it's actually there's that Woody Allen quote that comedy is just tragedy seen from a distance. There are lots of things in your life which tragic, terrible experiences. When you look back, you can see absurdities, which is you travel to London with Stephen and you find the local ANC office and you knock on the door, these two white middle class boys, and say, "We want to join the ANC." And they're looking, thinking, "This is a joke." you know, who does this? And they say, meet us in the cafe around the corner just to see if you're genuine.
mm,
And, they obviously realize that if you were undercover, no undercover police would be that naive to do that. And it sinks in that you're genuine. And they train you up and you learn about communications, you learn about finances, you learn about covert work. And then you're sent back to South Africa. And as I understand, you get a job as a researcher at the Institute for Social Development at the University of Western Cape, and that takes you in touch with townships. So it's an area you're interested in, and it works. But secretly, you're working with Stephen Lee. You rent a place. You're actually putting together and printing pamphlets, which will distribute using this device called the leaflet bomb, which they existed before, but you've come up with an innovative design. But it's interesting that you're already really your career now is your full-time covert operative. Your job, even your family, your friends, that's a cover. And it's really is an extraordinary double life, and it's an extraordinary sacrifice as well. That must have been very, very hard. You can't just hang out with the old friends, or relationships suffer, closeness with your family. But you kind of that must have actually sort of damaged your perception of life trying to live that way after a while.
yes, yes, it was extremely difficult and very, very stressful. The as I said earlier, you couldn't get into these townships to
Mm,
have a look. Um, we did manage to go in. Sometimes you could take a back route and get in and have a look. And I even spent a few nights in the townships.
mm,
But this job at the University of the Western Cape gave me that permit that I
mm,
needed because I was doing research on the housing situation and various things like that. And so I could go in and meet the municipal leaders and so on and speak to people and get
mm,
to understand the feeling. So it was tremendously useful. Um, but the double life, yes, it was very very stressful because I had to live a normal life. So I had this job,
mm,
had a girlfriend, I had all the normal things. Still had my family close by and my friends. And even when these actions happened that we had carried out in the streets of Cape Town, setting off these leaflet bombs and creating mayhem and creating headlines in the newspapers.
mm.
And then people are discussing this, and you have to, in a sense, lie about it. You can't say, well, that was
Yeah.
me, yes. How do you think I did this time?
Mm.
You couldn't say that. So you would take up the opposite position and say, well,
Well, that's the point.
yeah,
You can't even just be an affable liberal South African.
no,
You have to
yes,
pretend you think you're
yes,
on the side of the establishment.
that's right.
That
You
obviously
live this.
stymies the kind of friends you can make
Mm.
now. You kind
Not
of you
only
have to.
living a lie, you had to tell a lot of lies as well.
Yeah. But I think there's a wonderful moment. It's probably not relevant, but there's something mentioned that you were having a barbecue and the police down the road were gathering. You thought, are they spying? They have a kind of a barbecue down the road, and one of your circle goes up and says, "Are you spying on us?" And it is a kind of it's not so much it's that double life, it's kind of it's so locked into it that actually not thinking of the reality. Don't say that, don't do that. And of course they were. But to bring you back to, momentous and terrible times, really, March 1978, you and Stephen Lee are arrested and charged with, and quote, printing and distributing 18 different pamphlets on behalf of banned organizations, including the South African Communist Party, the ANC, and its armed wing, from 1975 to 1978. And custody is brutal and it's deliberately degrading. And I'm not going to go over that, but it's almost more degrading than the prison experience. It's deliberately so. And the trial is a farce, and you have things like there's a fake testimony from a Mr. X that's obviously fabricated. There's wild misinterpretation of the evidence by the state. There's accusations of being KGB spies. Um, and there's almost from a distance this kind of strange validation here that you have broken the law, and there's no doubt about that, and you can't really argue around that. However, the state is still rigging the trial and making up these lies because they obviously don't have faith in their own system. They actually don't believe their own rules. All this stuff about the superiority of it, but they obviously have no respect for their own constitution. And I think that's really telling. Of the time, probably you weren't thinking that, but it's and there's also this kind of tragedy as well. You have the worst lawyer with the worst opening statement ever, which is he actually says basically my client is technically guilty, but and then tries to come up with a defense. And really, ultimately, the only defense the lawyers can come up with is that you're an insecure young man who wants attention, and Stephen Lee is a simpleton who's easily influenced by you, and kind of you're kind of naughty schoolboys. And it's almost like if you're going to jail me, don't jail me for that. It's absolute. It's an absurdity. But as I say, you must have been thinking, they don't believe this. This is all a farce. And then they take you to prison, and I would say that you go to Pretoria. I mean, you get a longer sentence. You get 12 years because you're seen to be more intelligent, and Lee gets 8 years for being easily led. But what's interesting is you're at Pretoria Central Prison, and right from the start, escape was never not an option for you. You're not thinking, I've been caught, I've learned my lesson, I'll buy my time. You want to get out, and that's interesting as well. You know.
Yes, yes. They didn't. Well, I think they believed in what they were doing, but they tried to magnify
Mm,
the importance of well, essentially, it was just two guys producing some leaflets.
mm.
The leaflet bomb sounds terrible.
Yeah,
It's like these were bombers. And even if they didn't hurt anybody, they could have been bombs. All you need to do is remove the leaflet, put a bit more explosive in it,
yeah.
and there you've got a real bomb, and you could be a real terrorist. And South Africa is under attack, and here's some examples of it. So they had to magnify the importance of the action. But if you boil it down, it's really very little.
Mm,
But that's what they needed to do. The ANC was in exile.
mm.
There was almost no presence inside the
Yeah.
country. So even if we were white guys, which was kind of a bit strange, they're saying this
Mm.
ANC is just a bunch of black terrorists, and here's two white guys. A bit naive, but you
Teenagers
got to
going through a
watch out.
phase. Yeah,
Very important.
yeah.
They associated with the ANC, and the ANC is associated with the communists, and the communists are coming to get us. So it's like a big, huge communist conspiracy. This was the middle of the Cold War, and Western democracies were under threat from the Soviet threat.
Mm.
So,
And then of course they put you into prison with people like Dennis Goldberg, all these hardline activists. Now you've been
mm,
sending codes to your comrades in the ANC. You're now in a room with some very big names and thinkers, people you'd never be able to sit with them in real life. So that's a strange situation as well. That you can trade ideas. And of course, if they'd never done that, the the escape plan wouldn't have actually worked, would it? And that's kind of strange as well, a strange situation. And
yes. Well, we had the we were determined even before we got to
Mm,
prison that we were going to escape, almost from the very first day. In fact,
mm.
on the first day, Stephen made an escape attempt.
Yeah,
He complained about
yeah,
stomach pain or something, so they took him to the doctor and he jumped out the window.
yeah,
Unfortunately, he landed rather hard, and they pointed their guns at him and just told him
yeah.
to surrender, as it were. And then when we did get together eventually before our trial, we were discussing escape plans already.
Mm.
It's in
And
my
it,
book. We read this book about Papillon, which is a manual of
yeah,
escape, very well known book. So that gave us the inspiration and the ideas.
yeah. And what I find is remarkable is it's a little bit like you've done so many things, and it's a bit like the pop band that's always being asked about its greatest hit and has to play it, and they would say, "Well, I've done more." But the way you escaped is so remarkable. It's been covered by the film Escape from Pretoria with Daniel Radcliffe. So I don't want to dwell on that too much because people can see this film and it's excellent. But the way
Mm.
you escaped is such an insight into this other side of your mind. You have a political conscience, but you have a particular way of thinking in a technical way, solving technical problems. And I kept thinking about this escape. There's this extraordinary thing. If I can digress, there's a Chinese magician called Qing Ling Fu who used to come on stage at the turn of the century, and he could make a giant goldfish bowl appear and disappear. And people wondered how he did it. And the obvious thing was he hid it in his gown. But he was actually a very, very old, frail man. So it would have been impossible. And eventually, someone uncovered the trick was he spent his entire life pretending to be a frail old man. He was actually quite an athletic, fit young man. That's how he did the trick. You seemingly just walked out the front door of the prison. How did you do it? By unlocking 15 locks and walking out the front door of the prison. The genius is it's not so much in the technical side, but there's also the patience, the method to do it that way. I think that's extraordinary. That it's not what you see in the movies. It's such a long, thought out, methodical plan, and it requires everyone to help out. And it's almost a calling card of the way your mind works, I think. Because for people who aren't familiar, you had to look at the keys. You couldn't just, like in the films, just make an impression on soap. You had to look at it, study it. You had to put paper in the door, you get the thickness of the barrel, the thickness of the key bit, work out the different spokes of the key. And it's a very long process. And making it from two bits of wood so you're always across the grain. I mean, that takes extraordinary patience to do that. I think that's fascinating.
Yes, yes.
And uh, and then when it comes to the escape, there are other factors. You need civilian clothes, and luckily the prison officers are chucking out clothes for you to use as rags. You're reliant on the fact that the prison officers never do their job, so a certain guard is always slow on his rounds. Another one's so lazy he gives you the keys to the toolbox. But it's it's an interesting fact that only three of you could escape because at some point on the escape, because of the prison warden doing the rounds, you have to hide in a closet. And I think it's interesting that all the other prisoners, the older hardliners like Goldberg, they help you out, but they know they can't take part, and they know that this could affect their sentences. But you all come together. I think that's quite heartening, and it's a terrifying experience. But I mean, that must have given you some kind of emboldening when you did it.
Yes, we couldn't have done it if the other prisoners hadn't known about it. They were all supportive. Some decided they didn't want to be part of it because their sentences were due. A couple of them, they only had a year. In fact, one of them had left the prison just days after we escaped. We were worried that um, if he was released, 2 or 3 days before our escape, he would have been implicated.
Yeah,
Then he's out and he's planning to
yeah,
support us, and he knew they were going to escape, so we had to escape just before he was released. And then a couple of the other prisoners only had a year or two left, so they weren't going to be part of it. At one stage, practically everyone wanted to come, but as time progressed and as we
Mm.
realized that it would be impossible to get everyone out anyway, it was just whittled down to the three of us. And in fact, the final plan couldn't have accommodated more than three because, well, just because of that space that we needed,
Yeah,
it could
it's like
only
that glitch
accommodate
in the program, isn't it?
three people in the cupboard.
Uh,
So, yeah, some of them, the security situation kept changing.
mm,
As we found out more and more, then they realized it was not quite so simple and they just dropped out.
mm.
But they were all fully supportive right towards the end. Maybe they wouldn't have been if they had known what happened to them afterwards, because after our escape, they were quite badly treated. They were moved to another prison where they didn't have the same facilities. That prison of ours was actually probably the best prison in the entire country
Mm.
because it was a special prison for political prisoners. And the eye of the United Nations, special, I don't know what they ever call it, envoy for political
Yeah.
prisoners, they used to pay regular visits, and they kept our conditions very
Mm.
good. And unlike any other prison, we had knives and forks and proper plates, and even our own oven and a fridge and everything.
I know.
Because they
And
knew we weren't really, we weren't criminals, we weren't going to stab them or anything.
but it's an
So our
interest.
conditions were
There
good.
was,
So they ended up in this awful prison,
yeah.
which was actually the hanging prison.
Oh,
And they
yeah.
could hear these hangings taking place. So it was pretty awful for them.
But it is a funny thing. It's a strange thing that they let you go and they supported it because it's not because they wanted you to have a happy life. It's because if you would go back into the fight, you would help the cause and hopefully bring about change. And in that case, your release, so to speak, your escape, actually did have a payoff, as we've seen from events of your
Mm.
help in other systems and what ultimately happened. So yeah, it does show. Yes, it did have a real result that improved their lives. And I keep thinking as you're going through this kind of methodical system of stage by stage by stage, you leave your cell as a prisoner, you walk out as a civilian. Um, it's kind of like the information going through a computer program, the
Mm.
compartmentalization, and it's kind of like a foreshadowing of the Vula system. It's kind of a foreshadowing of the exchange. There's a certain kind of you have a certain fingerprint to the way you build systems.
Yeah.
It's kind of like if it was a novel, it'd be a foreshadowing. You know,
Mm.
at the time it was just a merciful release, but to bring it into now this thing that we've just would have just shown the Vula documentary, and people will be very well versed in that. But just to give a bit of background, you literally walk out of prison, you get a taxi, and then you travel from Mozambique, Zambia to Tanzania to London. You have the press conference with Oliver Tambo, who's acting head of the ANC. Then you go off to work for the International Defence and Aid Fund, but covertly you're working for the ANC again. You're training recruits. And the thing I want to stress, in case people don't realise, is that the ANC isn't really based in South Africa anymore. It's outside of South Africa, mainly in Lusaka. And it's not as if they're walking around freely on the streets of London. Margaret Thatcher isn't sympathetic to the ANC cause. Ronald Reagan isn't. So people are in hiding still. And the only way of communicating is this very laborious system of codes and invisible ink and letters and microfilm. It's very long winded. And people are getting dispirited. People can't really coordinate. And this problem has really been blocking the ANC for nearly 20 years. And that's something that you suddenly notice as you're training people and you're not hearing from them, isn't it? And you're realizing that it doesn't matter how much people are committed to a cause or what they feel. They've got to be able to work together. They've got to be able to talk to each other, coordinate. They've got to have a course of action. So you need a better system of linking people. It's got to be fast. It's got to be user friendly. And again, this is where you step in and you come up with that brilliant solution. And I think it's interesting that, home computers came out, and I think it was the Toshiba home computer you used with MS-DOS, and that can actually come up with a one-time encryption key so that you're not working with codes. But the thing that is also really intriguing is you've got to have some delivery system that's secure, that works, and using this thing called modems. Now, I was talking to Olivia. Olivia and I would have been in our early teens at that time, and at that time, home computers, and we would have been programming. And we were saying we probably knew as much about programming as you did then, really, because you're not trained in this, it's new. And it's but this brilliant use of the modem where the modem can encode the signal. But instead of playing it down the telephone line modem to modem, then this manual aspect comes in of recording the signal from the modem, playing it down the line to an answer phone. It's, that's quite ingenious, and I don't think anyone else could have come up with a solution like that. You know,
Well, this was before the internet. There was no
mm,
internet, so it's hard for a lot of people that when I explain, the mechanism and how it worked and all the different stages, they can't understand it because today it's just there on your screen and you just press a button and it goes through to the other side and it encrypts automatically. But in those days, we didn't have an internet, and even if there was some kind of computer communications between countries, there was nothing in South Africa because of
mm,
the boycott. I think there was one line running between one of the universities and
mm,
the rest of the world, and that was about it. So how do you send a message? You I mean, you talked about a modem to modem. That's possible, but that exposes you immediately to the
yeah,
fact that you're sending something.
yeah,
And if they're trying to listen, or if they're recording the
yeah,
signal as well, and it's encrypted, that's very, very suspicious.
yeah. And you're
And
hoping they've got a modem as well, you know.
you're hoping they've got a modem, but
Yeah,
presumably, they had a lot of assistance from
yeah,
their friends in other parts of the
yeah,
country sorry, other parts of the world who assisted them. So we couldn't do that, and so the only option really was radio or telephone, using public telephones. Now, radios, South Africa is a very long way away
mm,
from anywhere, and even if you're broadcasting to Zambia, that's kind of suspicious, although no one can detect where your signal
yeah,
is going because it goes everywhere. But still, here they pick up a signal, and it's very easy to trace a signal because you
mm,
just, even in the Second World War, they were triangulating signals and trying to
mm,
figure out the source of them, and then you would more or less detect the source, and then you would go and bomb the place, or at least surround it and
yeah,
capture the people. So the same would have applied. So what do? You can't send the signal from a business phone number or from a
mm,
private phone. That would be immediately traceable. And we
mm,
knew they monitored the telephone lines, especially
yeah,
lines going abroad. So public telephones was the only option. And how do you go into a telephone booth? We still had telephone booths in
yeah.
those days. I
With the
don't
coins
think
and that, yeah.
I don't think there are any left in the world anyway.
Ah,
Um, you go in there with your laptop and your modem, and where do you plug the modem in? They weren't even battery powered. I think they worked,
mm,
still had a power source. So you couldn't really do that.
mm,
So the option the only option was to record that signal onto a small tape recorder and take the tape recorder into the public telephone. You
mm,
dial up a number in London, you simply play that
mm.
tones, just a high pitched tone sound. Most people from that era remember that. Today
I
you
I
don't hear
remember
that
loading
anymore.
up video games, and of course the signal cuts out. You're 20
Yes,
minutes in and the signal fades and you start again.
yes.
Yeah, it's a mix of something that's very, very high tech, and from the perspective now, very much hammer and chisel carving on stone, very
Mm.
low tech. and probably, as you say, probably to your benefit, because if it'd been completely high tech, maybe it would
Mm,
have been detected.
yes.
And I think it's interesting, your flat, presumably this wasn't made public. Your flat was nicknamed GCHQ and full of equipment. I mean, that might have given away a few cues. For anyone who doesn't know, GCHQ were in trouble at the time for basically phone tapping everyone. And it became quite a scandal. But at the same time, as I say, you've got this human network of people. You're working with Ronnie Press, who deserves a mention. He's setting up the test runs from Lusaka. There's Connie Brahm in Amsterdam, and you can do trips to Amsterdam. You're trying to get equipment. You've got Antoinette, the courier, who she's a air stewardess, and she really loves the smuggling aspect, getting equipment to South Africa. And one thing is probably not relevant, but the guy supporting you in the ANC is Mac Maharaj, and he's got this system where he's traveling around the world pretending to be terminally ill as this dying man looking for treatment. And he arrives and he's like that. Meanwhile, he goes in disguise and sneaks through customs to another country. And there's this ridiculous situation once when he's South Africa. He has to then appear officially. So he goes out the country and then he has to appear in front of everyone as if he's had a miracle cure from Russia and he's healthy again and he comes in. When I was at that time, I went to London and I got a book on spycraft and I was fascinated. And I thought, well, no one really does this, but it's this kind of human network of of course, when stuff is so low tech, it's hard to detect. I find it fascinating that there's a theme here that you need a good communications network, but you need
Mm,
people who can use it and are willing. And of course, Vula goes active in August 1989, so it's been a long process. And people forget it's to communicate between the ANC, and there's this huge traffic, but there's also this thing of a pipeline eventually through to Nelson Mandela. He's in negotiations with the South African government, and he's got to be in a position, if he's going to negotiate, he's really got to know what the rest of the ANC are thinking. Otherwise, he's going to be very hesitant. But because of your system, he can find out what they're thinking. He can communicate backwards and forwards. And suddenly he's free, and suddenly the negotiations actually work. And you said there was that momentous occasion when you see his message on your screen and you think, this is working. This is not just, I'm not just some lunatic in a flat. That,
yes, yes.
and
Yes, that's a very important moment, being able to communicate, because Nelson Mandela himself was communicating with the National Party officials. They were planning to release him from about a year or two before he was actually released. So a lot of negotiations were taking place at that time. Business leaders were meeting with the ANC in African countries. The National Party itself couldn't directly be seen to be, on the one hand, telling us, these terrible communist terrorists, and then on the other hand, negotiating with them.
yeah,
But in a
they've
sense,
got a
they were
safe face. Yeah.
negotiating.
Mm.
They were negotiating with Mandela, and they thought they had him in this room, and he was just this isolated old man with no connection to anyone,
Mm.
just his own thoughts, and they were trying to plan his release and get his ideas about the future. And so they thought they had him alone, but meanwhile he was
Mm.
communicating with the ANC leadership in Lusaka through these messages.
Yeah.
And as I said, when that first one came through, my eyes stood out in stalks, because I knew they were trying to make contact with Mandela through the
Mm.
lawyer, but I didn't really think that much would come out of it. It's just like, oh, okay, he's all right and he's healthy or something like
Yeah.
that. But then these long reports came
Yeah.
and appeared on my computer screen, and I couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
So that was quite an event. And then
And
very shortly, we were getting
mm.
responses back from that side, from the other side, from the leadership, back to Mandela. And then it was like a ping pong game, these
and it,
messages.
it, it's a vindication, isn't it, of all that work that
Mm,
just one person in a network of single people doing small things
yeah.
is making a difference. Because one thing you said is that Vula managed to do more, well, the ANC using Vula managed to do more in 2 years than it had in 20 years, just because
Mm,
people could communicate and move forward
that's
and
right.
just go over things. Things were moving very fast because of this. I mean, Mandela was released in February 1990. The ANC were then legalized, and the Vula system is almost going on to through email, like almost like an internet system. And as I say, this is very much moving forward quickly. But I think there's kind of an interesting twist to the Vula story, which I feel bad about mentioning. But the fact that there were this in July 1990 there was a series of police raids, and NC activists were arrested on a completely unrelated matter, and the police found a code book that one of these people shouldn't actually have kept. It was a code that should have been destroyed. And the fact they had a code book, this was kind of concession. This was a low-tech concession, just for speed for certain people. Okay, just use a code. And I just think there's a kind of bittersweet lesson here that no matter how good a communication system is, how sophisticated, the coin of phrase, people have to be able to use the bloody thing. You know, that you know
Yes.
programming your video recorder. How many people bother to do it? You've got to get around that problem. And I think that's where your technical side comes in. And there's something I can tell it. Now something must have been at the back of your mind for things to come, because when you get to 1992, there is the white electorate approving elections. And then 1994, you get the first free elections. You get the ANC with a 62% majority. You've got Mandela forming the government of national coalition. You know all this. You were made head of the electronic information unit, which is basically the government's IT guy bringing them into the digital age. And at the risk of sounding asinine, you could say, well, all men are equal. Apartheid's over. Your work is done now, isn't it? You know, thank you. You sail off in the sunset. It's all done. It's fixed, isn't it? Isn't it?
Yes, that's pretty much how I felt. I achieved what I set out to
Mm.
do, and well, I mean, I can't claim that the overthrow of apartheid had much to do with me, but I mean,
Well, it did, but
that's what we'd got rid of it, and
yeah,
that's what I dedicated my time to for the previous 20 years or so, and it was over, and eventually I left the ANC. I mean, not for political reasons. It's just that I set up my own business and was
mm,
doing a lot of government work obviously because of the connections. So, but the fun had come to an end.
yeah. I mean, you didn't want to stay on in politics.
Yes, that's correct.
Uh,
Well, I was never really a very political
mm,
person. I mean, I got
mm,
involved in this stuff, but for me, it was about getting rid of apartheid and just playing a role. I didn't. I was never one of the political gurus or was invited to go and talk about
mm.
politics or anything like that. It was just this backroom quiet guy who sat and got things done. And
Mm.
that was my role. And well, we all play roles in these different struggles and so on. And I guess that's the way it is today,
Yeah, but
playing
it's
that
an
same kind of role.
but it's an interesting thing. I mean, a lot of people have said about South Africa since there have been in government, there have been corruption trials, there hasn't been squeaky clean. People have complained about how the system works now, uh, and it kind of, I dare to say, it sort of brings home that this struggle isn't really about race. Underneath it is a deeper struggle about social injustice, social inequality. And I think it's interesting that just saying no, apartheid's over, but it doesn't fix the problem. There is something deeper going on here in the system. And I think that's interesting, because a lot of people say, oh, well, they solved it and things are just as bad. No, no, there's a wider problem here. And as you say, from what I gather, you said that time is done. I'm going to have a family, an easy life, my life, not hiding as an encoding, but you've deserved it. And it's happening at a point where, you're not a young man anymore. It's your time. But There, as I understand, there was an Australian goes to Cape Town and puts an advert in the newspaper and says it's got a trading system. I think it was Let's, and it's like you can trade without money. Fantastic idea. And I, is that something that caught your eye? Was there like a little spark that says there's something more here?
Yes, exactly. I studied economics and I was always interested in following the economics and geopolitics and all that kind of thing. Not that I was a participant in it, but it just fascinated me as it still does today. And what I realized after about 5, 6 years of apartheid-free South Africa that
Mm,
nothing very much had changed. You know,
mm,
there were the apartheid structures, although they were very rigid at the time, they just became a bit furry around the edges, and you had some wealthier black people moving into formerly white areas and so on.
mm.
But it remained in place as such, especially at the economic level.
Yeah.
You know, the whites still control the heights of the economy, and most of the big corporations were all wealthy white people who had their fingers in global pies and had connections with all the big mega corporations around the world. And the big corporations that had boycotted South Africa during the apartheid era moved back to South Africa. And so the levers of control remained
Mm.
with the white people, and I think that was almost part of the negotiated settlement. We wouldn't rock the boat. South Africa has a
Mm.
strong economy. It's the number
Yeah.
one economy in Africa.
Yeah. Mm.
Let's just keep it going, and then we'll attract all this investment from
Mm.
abroad.
You can keep your money.
The jobs will proliferate, and everyone will be happy and live happily ever after. And it just didn't happen, and the more I looked at it, the more I realized, well, it's an obvious truth that if the economic power remains in the hands of the whites, then that is essentially really where the power comes from. It's not Politics is almost secondary.
Yeah. Yeah.
we won the we as the ANC won the political struggle, and nothing changed. So what's going wrong? And
Mm.
it's obvious that economic there was no economic revolution. There was nothing changed hands much. A few token black faces appeared on the board of directors
Mm.
of big companies, but nothing really changed. Then I realized, well, it's the money power is the real power. It's not the political power. Well, political power is important if you control the guns, but the economic power is really where the instructions come from. So then I started to look at the nature of money. Well, I understood it to a certain degree, but this guy coming from Australia and setting up the first Let's system, I just found this absolutely fascinating. If you don't need money, then surely people can just create their own local economy, and you don't need to
Mm.
worry about who owns the
Yeah.
economy, and you can do it yourself.
Well, it strikes me at the heart of your thinking, reading around, that there's a paradigm shift. And I'm going to see if I can summarize it correctly, because I think it's behind all this. It's not just trading. And it's the idea that money is a control system. And the point is, historically, it wasn't always. 1,000 years ago, the power was in the hands of monarchy. It was where you were in that social hierarchy from the monarch. An impoverished prince would have more power than a rich merchant. And then the Industrial Revolution comes along, and that's where money actually takes the lead. And it has been since then for about 250 years. But the point is, it's not actually first thing, it's not an apparatus of state. It's a private commodity, like Snickers bars, sold to you by a private company, a bank. And we could just trade in Snickers bars like kids do in the schoolyard, but we just happen to use these pieces of paper called money. And the idea is these pieces of paper facilitate the exchange system, which is the buying of goods and services, which we need. What Adam Smith says, everyone has a need, everyone can buy the stuff, someone will make it, all things are equal. But instead of using money to buy goods and services, we're using goods and services to acquire money. And the paradigm shift you're saying is, look, you've been, we're used to money, we don't see it, but this is what it is. We need to change that. It's the wrong way round, and that's it. We need, and perhaps this money system as it is perhaps the major player behind this social inequality. Really, not so much system, but our perception of it. And that's what I sense is where you're coming from there.
Yes, that's correct. I mean, you're talking about the ancient idea of the sort of the CMC paradigm where you have a commodity and then you have some money in order to exchange it for another commodity.
Yeah.
That was the original idea of money, was that it's just a medium to facilitate exchange. Once that mechanism, the money mechanism, was hijacked, as it were, well, it's always been hijacked right from the beginning.
Yeah.
It was always the sovereign who created the money, but majority of the population didn't really engage in any money system, as it were. Money was really used for trading, between the sovereign or the king, the emperor, and the business owners or the owners of property. The peasants really managed to trade basically through bartering of various kinds. And it's when, as you say, when the after the bourgeois revolutions in Europe, and the commercial classes took power and ousted the feudal classes, that money became central. So they took over the creation of money, as it were, and the first central banks and so on. And then the paradigm shift changed from CMC to MCM. This is not something I've invented. All the old economists, Adam Smith, used this acronym. So then you're starting off with a pile of money and you create some commodities. So the commodity is really the money, and the object of production is more money. So you have started with money, you create some objects which you sell, call them commodities, and then you get more money. So you're profit driven. So the second M has got to be bigger than the first M. You start off with X amount, and then you want X plus N amount at the end of it. So that's how money works. And as you know, it's essentially a control system, and it always will be, so long as it remains in private hands. So what we're trying to do is not really reinstate CMC, but well, in a sense, do away with money. So most people, when you say do away with money, they say, "Oh, you want to go back to barter?" Like, that was the whole point of money, was to get over the barter. You can't
which
have
is tied one to one.
Yes.
I
Well,
want
that's
chickens, and
what
all
the
you've got is
economic
bread.
book
Yeah.
said. You got this incompatibility. You've got to have two people wanting what the other wants. But even if you go back in time, there's never been such a society, where everyone just bartered things. And even if there was what you suspect is barter, you've got to take into account the time gap between giving and receiving. So if I give you apples in the middle of summer, because that's when they grow, and you don't give me anything, but you promise oranges in the middle of winter when they grow, then you just got to keep a record of that. And when you bring in that time factor, then barter is not so silly, because you don't even have to specify what it is. You could say, here's your apples, but then you just make good later on, do something for me or whatever, So bartering is not just a one-to-one. I've got shoes, I'm looking for shirts, and then you're wandering around. They create this picture of, the cobbler wandering around with his shoes trying to find
Mm.
a shirt maker, and it's just ridiculous. There's never been such a society.
Yeah.
People have lived for millions of years or hundreds of thousands of years,
Well,
trading, as it were, with each other without
yeah.
without money.
That's kind of when we look at human history, what we know of, when we go back to recorded history, people seem to have money. When we go back to the time of Plato, people are using money. When we go back to what we know of very early societies, it was communal property, communal wealth. It's almost as if we kind of skipped the bar. If there was a bartering stage, we skipped it very quickly.
Mm,
We just existed as a family, as a tribe. We didn't have that individual thing, and then suddenly money comes in. And it's interesting saying about money, about control, because kind of when Adam Smith was writing about the market economy, he was of the school of Rousseau, Edmund Burke. These were Thomas Paine. These were people who believed in a social contract. They were saying we don't have to obey kings and queens. We opt into society because we get something from it. And Adam Smith is saying, well, there's this wonderful stuff called money. With money, we can have a democracy. We can trade freely. You've got something I want. I've got something you want. It levels out. And then, as you say, but it's not that. As Marx said, about 70 years later, and it took 70 years after Adam Smith for him to say, well, most of our money is taken by an employer. Businesses force monopolies. Banks give money to people and take away, irrespective of how well they're doing. The stockbrokers bet on it. So all these people it's supposed to be this level system, but outside of these people just betting on it, moving blocks of money, and eventually collapses. And we're living at a time now since the 2008 crash, which was people moving invisible blocks of money, the subprime mortgages. People selling a mortgage for $200,000 and saying, you're going to pay me back 250,000. I get the receipt, I put it in the banking system, but that 250,000 doesn't exist yet. And they're
mm.
moving this invisible money around until someone one day realizes it doesn't exist, it crashes. But that's
Mm.
become our global economy now. And what you're coming up with is a kind of a very viable alternative, you could say, a very necessary one.
My belief is that, if why does money need to exist? So someone has to. We think of money as stuff, like there's a quantity of it.
Mm,
Anything that exists has to exist in quantity. Even if it's virtual, it has to be quantity. You can think of
mm,
bitcoins and you can say, well, they don't really exist. It's just a figment of your imagination. But
mm,
they exist virtually and they have to be created. That's why they have all these computers mining these coins and so on. And there's a fixed quantity of them and you can count
mm,
them. And even in, fiat currency, um, strict controls about how much money can be created. That's why you have central banks and they manipulate the interest rates and so on. If there's too much money, there's said to be inflation, or rather, inflation is said to be because there's too much money. So
yeah.
therefore, we must cut down the quantity of money. And there's all these theories about how to control money. But essentially, there's a quantity of it. So there's a
Mm,
number, and if you go to the government documents of the central bank, they'll say there's so many millions dollars, pounds, whatever it is, in existence in this country, and they count it, and it has a number. And if you look at how trading takes place these days,
mm.
there's no physical coins. We have a few
Yeah.
coins, but mostly we're just paying with cards. Mostly we're paying with our phones these days, or it just happens through huge transfers. Numbers get transferred through accounts, through banking apps, and
Mm,
banking, I don't know, through the SWIFT system and so on. It's all just numbers going up and down on computers. There's nothing physical moving
mm,
around. It's not little guys down in the vault of the bank saying, oh, this bag of
mm.
gold goes onto
No,
that guy's shelf.
it's become abstract, hasn't it?
It's
Theoretical.
totally abstract. So it's
Yeah.
just numbers. Why do we need to have money if it's just numbers? You can do away with this idea that money exists, even in quantity. So if it's just one account goes up, I sell you something,
Mm,
my account goes up, yours goes down. Why did we need a quantity of anything to record that? We can simply record those numbers. So that's essentially the idea behind CES or even the basic debt system.
Mm,
It's just there are no coins. There's no quantity of anything. And you're not, when the transaction takes place, I sell you, say, a bicycle. And the conventional thinking is I give you this bicycle. And in exchange for that, you give me some coins.
mm.
In a sense, it's almost like bartering. I'll give you
Yeah.
coins, you give me a bicycle. And so there's a two-way action. There's a bicycle going from the provider to the recipient, and in the other direction, there's coins going from the provider of the coins to the recipient of the coins.
Mm.
And it's a closed loop.
Yeah.
So you get bicycle, I get coins. That's the end of it. But today, that's just numbers. And why did we need a coin? Number of coins. Why did the coins have to be created? What are we actually measuring here? That
Mm,
bicycle really was, I gave it to you. It's just a transfer of ownership. Now we've put a number on that bicycle, a value, and we say it's a count of coins, but does it need to be a count of coins? It can be just a
mm,
number, a value. Or if I provide some service to you, I don't know, service your car or mow your lawn or something, we just put a number on it, and that number represents, as it were, my energy input
mm,
or the time I put into it or whatever. How do you measure value? So we're just recording the transfer of
mm,
value. And so I mow your lawn and you should be giving me coins. And I said, don't give me coins. Let's just record that in a ledger.
mm,
So we both got nothing in our ledger. We just got two names. And I mowed the lawn, so I get 100 points and you get minus 100 points. That's exactly what money does as
mm,
well. No, you buy something, your account goes down by minus the price of it, and the other guy's account goes plus the price of it.
mm.
The price is really just the value that you put on it.
Yeah.
So essentially, why do you need those coins? In the past, you needed them because we didn't have
Mm,
electronic card machines, and we didn't have the
mm,
internet, and we didn't have credit cards and debit cards and
mm,
telephones with NFC and all that kind of stuff.
mm,
But today we do. So why do we need the coins? And if you get rid of the coins, then you get rid of the creation process. Now, no one has the opportunity and the benefit that derives from making money. So banks derive enormous
mm.
benefit from so-called creating the money when they lend it to you. You go
Um,
there and say, I want to buy a house, and they say, here's £1 million. But after 20, 30 years, you've got to give us back £3 million or four,
mm.
So where do those extra £3 million come from?
Yeah. And of course, as we know, there's so many scandals in the banking system where with bearer bonds that they've been counting this money as real. It goes in the system,
Yes.
it's accounted. I mean, an equivalent would be someone like Elon Musk, who's worth 300 billion. His companies have never made a profit. His car company doesn't make a profit. He gets handouts every year from the government of 5 billion. It's just the value of his shares, which is people giving him IOU, sorry, rather him giving people IOUs. They give him money. So he's basically got 3 billion loan, 3 billion in debt. So you could say, well, yes, but he's got all those shares. Yes, but the minute he starts to sell them, the value drops. It's like
Mm.
owning 10 copies of the Mona Lisa. If you sell one, you
Yeah.
make a fortune. Once you start selling three, people think, hello, this isn't valuable anymore. So it's that kind of it's phantom
Yeah.
economics. And
It,
one thing I think that's interesting about when you started up the community exchange system is that you were looking at people in townships still who really didn't have the money, the credit to go anywhere to buy things. And yet they obviously, the goods and services part, the abilities they had. There's a resource here. There isn't the money, but there is the resource here for a trading system. It isn't like, you know, okay, I've given you money, but what can we do with it? No, these people can do things. People can repair cars, or mow lawns, or do nursing, or drive buses, or anything. They have skills. By creating this system, it mobilizes that, I hate to say it, lower part of the economy or society that's overlooked. And what's really clever is whereas Let's is a paper-based system, by being online, you can have it on your phone. It's quicker, it's simpler, and you can do this globally. And that's, I mean, you ran this system in 2002 with Dan Northcott, who was a science teacher, and it was worked as an online system. You've done all the coding, and again, self-taught. And then it goes online officially next year as the Cape Town Talent Exchange. And I mean, this is a very different system to Let's. It's a much more sophisticated. Um, and and then, do you remember what the first trade was?
Well, I did. I don't know exactly which was the first one, but my first trade was servicing someone's car. I changed the oil. Uh, Simple things like that you could
Yeah.
do, you know. And we've had all kinds of trades on the system. I mean, obviously, it's still a very small
Hmm.
operation compared to the global economy.
Yeah.
So, you know, we're not buying and selling houses and cars and, you know, air tickets and so on. But hopefully, it'll grow.
Well, you've got 7,000 members in Cape Town, right? And if I can go over the figures here, um, 2004 you had 700 members, most of them 540 in the Cape Town group. 2006 you had 6,700 members worldwide. In 2010 you created Clearing Central to ease global exchange, because there's a tech thing here. I don't want to go down a wormhole here, but
Mm.
a group has to, and programming has to be a closed system for this to work. But you want to be able to trade freely with someone in another group across the world. And there's a kind of programming feat where I think I'm trading with you, but I'm actually trading with a virtual person in my group that goes through the wormhole to his twin in your group, and the money goes to you. It's a kind of a long-winded piece of computing that's quite brilliant, but to us, we just think it's direct. And that's quite a breakthrough. 2011, there's 4,000 members in Cape Town. 2013, there's 485 groups in 53 countries. But 2019, now you've got servers. You've got CES International in Cape Town, which is a global server. You've got Taiwan, Australia, because it's doing very well there. There's also a New South Wales server for Time Banks Australia. And then what's I think is interesting here is the Spanish server, which Argentina, Brazil, France, Greece, Italy, Spain, Mexico. So there are now more than 1,000 groups in over 100 countries. But the South America thing, something very interesting is happening there as it's taking off. You know, it's becoming quite a force, isn't it?
Yes, yes. In Ecuador, of all places,
Mm,
I can't really explain it. It's I think there's an organization there called Proyecto DINEC. I'm not sure what that stands for. It's an
mm,
acronym. The EC part is Ecuador, obviously.
mm,
Anyway, the guy there has also been experimenting with all kinds of alternative currencies, and he discovered CES. In fact, some years ago, he set up a group,
mm,
and nothing really much happened. Then suddenly it took off, and one day he said to us, "This group is full. It can only take 10,000 members, and what do we do next?" I just said, "Well, create more. You know, create more
mm,
groups and create them all over the country." And that's what they did, and they just created them, and they just within a few months we had hundreds of these groups, and they still today every single day there's new ones.
mm,
Um, um, Difficult to monitor exactly what's happening with them because it's a learning process. You know, the mindset of
mm,
people in countries like Ecuador is that there's only one thing, and that's dollars. You know,
yeah.
their national currency is the US dollar. So they even call it dollars, but they
Mm,
know it's not. But for some reason, it's really taken off there, and this organization now has fingers in all the surrounding countries. That's Peru and Bolivia and Colombia, and even across to Cuba. They've started groups in these places. But the CES also can, through this clearing central that you mentioned, the idea of it was that different trading systems could trade with each other
Yeah.
through this system. So in a sense, it operates a bit like the global SWIFT system, where you have all banks around the world using a single mode of connection, as it were. Um, there are other systems, the Chinese have developed theirs and the Russians have developed theirs, and but that's the main one for the world. So it's a sort of mirror of that. How do you
Yeah.
connect all these different groups? And our object is to keep everything small and
Yeah.
local. It's called community exchange system, and LETS was called local exchange trading system, because the idea was that a community itself, since you have no money making central point
Mm.
or no mechanism of control using the exchange, don't want to call it a medium because it's not a medium, but the exchange mechanism, using that to control others and to allow the concentration of power or money or whatever you want to call it. So that won't happen. It can't happen because, in a sense, we're all creating our own money, or at
Mm.
least creating value and
Yeah.
exchanging it through the mechanism.
Mm.
So we've got over the barter thing, but we're doing it without money. So when you try to explain it to a lot of people, you say it's a moneyless exchange system. They say, "Oh, it's just another barter system."
No.
Not. It's like getting to the essence of what money is and bringing it into the modern era, into the computer era or the internet era, and saying, well, we don't need the objects. We don't need to have millions of computers consuming huge amounts of energy, producing virtual coins,
Yeah.
complete waste of energy
Mm.
and time. Why not just count? Just count.
Yeah.
Go back to the abacus and just
Yeah.
count things.
But what you've got is the versatility of money. That's
Yes.
the thing. You've got the versatility of being able to trade universally. And
Mm.
it's an interesting thing when you're talking about Ecuador, South America. These are countries that have a very, very big below the line economy. That is to say, when you calculate GDP, this is the stuff that isn't counted. The
Mm.
guy just running a taxi service from his yard, as I say, the guy who does a bit of building work, but he's not necessarily on the books. There's a lot of that in these countries. Um, and it's interesting that a lot of economists now, they don't judge a nation's wealth by GDP, what the developing economists. They go by the genuine growth indicator because that takes into account it's not how much money, it's standard of living, education, health. The minute you look at one of these nations like that and judge it that way, not just the money flow, then suddenly
Mm.
the community exchange system becomes a player. It's doing
Yes.
something that is actually being accounted for.
Yeah.
You know, it's not just a hidden force to the side in the cracks. It's what I'm saying is there's a point where this becomes a very overt, significant force in the global system. Do you envisage that down the line?
Well, we would like to think that it could do that or become that. And obviously, that's been my dream right from the start. And, in our group that we've put together to try and create a CES version 2 of it, which is not just really a software, well, it is a software project, but it's also how do we get this message out to the world and to understand that you can trade across the world, you can trade in any quantity or any amount and do anything that the global economy can do in fact in a much more efficient way and a much more equitable way and a more friendly way and a community way and the focus is on relationships rather than collecting coins. You mentioned Elon Musk. Now, if a person's worth is calculated in what they actually contribute, How can anyone contribute billions and billions worth of dollars? They can't. His worth is more than entire countries. So how can one
Yeah.
person create more value than millions of people? He can't. So there's something wrong with the system
Hmm.
that can give one person so much power. Uh, that money represents a claim on on the community. So in a sense, he could buy up entire countries.
Yeah. It's insane.
Uh, how can one person create the equivalent value of an entire country? You can't. So
Yeah. And a
the
man
whole
whose stock
system is
value,
rigged.
his stock value has gone up recently because he's been buying his own stock. That makes no sense.
One's value should only
Yeah.
be measured
Yeah.
according to what you can provide.
Hmm.
So that's what this system would do.
Hmm.
It's not taking money from others. It's not like a socialist or communist system and saying, okay, we're going to punish the wealthy and tax them to death and give the money to the poor people. Everyone has an equal opportunity. If you sit
Hmm.
on your butt and do nothing, then obviously your value will be nothing. But if you provide something valuable to the community, then your claim on the community
Hmm.
is equivalent. So what you give is what you can receive, and what you receive is what to be measured in terms of what you give. That's just a normal, fair kind of trading system, isn't it? The
Well,
way
it's
the economy
interesting.
works.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, I mean, you said when this guy suggested his Let's system, when you try to system out on the people in hiking with, it just becomes that very middle class thing of people sort of
Mm,
trading. I've got I don't know, I've got a hang glider, or I've got some LPs. Things that people don't really need, don't really want, and you're interested in the people who don't have anything but do have talents and ability. I mean, talents in the general sense. And what you have in Cape Town, this is this is this is a very practical system. I think you said at some point the business you owned actually used the community exchange for part of its workings because it's saved on paperwork because the exchange is so transparent to use. I mean
yeah,
that's working within a commercial business now.
yes,
It's that's going beyond a hobby, isn't it? It is this actually has legs in the commercial sector.
it does, and it could. A lot of businesses look at it and think, well, how do we account for the sales here? We've had to buy stuff we've manufactured stuff and it's all recorded and we have to pay
Mm,
tax on it. And if we're just using the community exchange system to sell stuff and get points, it's off the books. And how do we account for that? So
mm,
it is problematic for businesses, but there are ways around that. You could I'm not suggesting anyone does this, but you could just say that, you're giving it to charity or something like
mm.
that, and then it's off the books. So it is in a sense incompatible, but you can't just take a regular business and just move it across to the community exchange system because you still have to pay tax and you got to register with the government and all that stuff. But it's a slow process, you can't just overnight jump from one to the other.
But it has potential to go in that
It ha-
direction, though.
it has that potential. It's
Mm,
we've always sort of seen it as a kind of lifeboat,
mm,
although we don't like to think of it as we've done this to provide a lifeboat, or we're waiting for the global economy to collapse and let's promote collapse and then we can
mm.
take over.
Yeah.
Not like that at all. It's just starting small, community based. People get used to it. They realize you don't need money to exchange things. You just need a mechanism to facilitate exchange. And that's what the system provides. And it can do what money does.
Mm,
I give examples of when I traveled to Australia, I had all my accommodation on the system there. And I didn't have to take traveler's
mm,
checks with me or you know, get dollars before I left or anything like that.
mm.
You just go there and you have your thing. You stay in a place for a while, and then they just debit your account, and it's over. It's so clean and so smooth. You don't have to wait for days for it to clear through the banks and all that sort of thing. There's no interest charges. There's no middlemen taking a cut here and a cut there, and
Mm. Yeah.
change rates and all this nonsense.
And it's self-sustaining as well. You know, it
Sustaining.
takes a small levy, and that pays for operating costs. And I keep
Yes.
thinking it's a little bit like 15 years ago with something like eBay. It was just this weird online barter site. Within
Mm,
10 years, if I needed something practical like a power tool, I'd buy it from eBay. And something like
mm,
PayPal, which was this strange sort of thing to make your trade safer when you bought something. Well, now in real life, you pay and it's just one of the options.
mm,
It's this thing just gradually coming into the real world and becoming normalized. You
mm,
know, and so I think there's a potential there, particularly because I mean I live in Northern Ireland. We're technically part of Great Britain. We're part of the first world. And we've had this thing for the last 10 years where we keep being told the economy is doing well, the economy is growing. And there was one time about 15 years ago when David Cameron said the economy is going through a boom, fastest growing ever. And literally the same week we went to our supermarket and the loaves of bread had shrunk and the price had gone up. And everyone commenting on this disparity because there's the money system and there's the pound in your pocket. And these are completely divorced now. They've
yeah.
come complete. And I think as those two things have become divorced, and then the CAS becomes important because
Mm,
there is this part of somehow in the trading system of the world is being neglected. And another thing I wanted to say, I mean, most people know how it works, but to state it, it's still a very simple system. You join, you advertise what you want or what you need. Let's say you're advertising that you mow lawns. Someone comes to you, you thrash out a deal, what you think your services as a lawnmower is worth, and you give them a trading slip. They sign it for the value, and that goes in the system. And you can log into this system. You see the adverts. You've got emails. You've got accounts, trading sheets. It's very simple. It's recorded, and it's the interesting thing is you set your value. You're not tied to the gold standard. It's not technically money because money is limited by the amount of gold there is. If money didn't have
mm,
a limit on it, then it wouldn't be worth anything. So you could say, well, well, talents are ways we can make as many as we want. But I think it's interesting that it's still something that facilitates trading. And I think that's the important bit, how it comes in. But like I say, what you have in Cape Town, what they've got in South America, this is now becoming a part of people's lives, a very practical part. And that's what also interests me because it's something I'm seeing over here in Northern Ireland. It's the social aspect. And you could say that the group I'm in is set up by Olivia and Elaine. It's actually as part of a network of groups across the north coast of Northern
mm,
Ireland. And you could say, well, a little bit middle class, aren't we? But Northern Ireland's a little bit like Texas, culturally, economically. The thing that it's not San Francisco. People have very, very conservative attitudes. There is a kind of a conservative hegemony that, people will not believe it, but these attitudes prevail. And traditionally, we've of course had the divide between the Catholic and Protestant community. And I know people watching this will think he's not going to mention the T word, the Troubles, but it's just a fact. We have power sharing now, but there's still a divide. It's Catholic political parties in government with Protestant ones.
mm,
We've never had a Mandela who says, "I speak for everyone." We haven't had that change, and most people I know live in one community or the other, and they don't go outside it, not because they're bigoted, but because it makes life easier. Because we have a phrase, you don't want to put your head above the parapet. And when I joined this group, it was with people where that didn't matter. They were beyond those attitudes.
mm,
That question that I've always faced, having an English accent, and my dad's Northern Irish, I've lived here most of my life, but as my partner says, I carry a loaded accent on me. I don't have to answer that question of, why am I here? What, and I'll have things explained to me. It was just, no, no, we're moving forward. We think differently. This is about people across the North Coast interacting, helping each other. A brilliant thing that Olivier and Elaine have organised are the work days. And it's like the Amish, barn building in a day kind of thing. We had terrible
mm,
storms earlier this year, worst storms ever, forests
mm,
decimated. And they got together and they're clearing these damn big trees using heavy
mm,
equipment. People you'd never think would do that kind of thing. So that's wonderful. I'm seeing people involved in each other's lives, and I'm seeing people from one town involved in the workings of a community in another town, which
mm.
this society is a big deal. Um, and that part attracts me to this group. In 25 years of living here permanently, I've never seen anything like that. And there's a part of
Mm.
me thinking, there's the money part side, there's the economic side, the trading side, and there's a part of me thinks we could be trading baseball cards. The fact that we're talking together and integrating and working on this level, that that I think for Olivia and Elaine to do that's an incredible achievement, and I kind of you must be seeing an element of that as well, social change.
Oh, yes, we do. We have regular markets as well, and they're almost just a more of a social gathering rather than a trading
Hmm.
experience. I, sometimes we have markets where there's a regular market. So maybe on the one side of the road is our talent market, on the other side is the regular South African rand market, and you can feel the difference just by
Hmm.
attending the one. You go across to the one, and they're all looking at you. And you want to buy some of this or this or this? They want to just get your money out of you.
Hmm.
The other side, it's all relaxed. The stall holder doesn't even have to be there. It's just like help yourself, and just sign
Hmm.
for it.
Hmm.
And it's a completely different vibe, and
Hmm.
many of our markets, people just come there and they don't even buy anything or receive anything. They just come there to chat because it's that sense of community. You can see this right from, to go back to the mechanics of it. Um, you have a ledger in the bank when you buy something, and the way it works is that you have two accounts. One goes up and the other goes down. So the one account, the way it's seen is the money goes from the one account, so it goes down, and that same money is transferred to the other account. There's a physical transfer of something because in the money system, money exists and there's a
Hmm.
quantity. It goes from one account to the other. But if you look at our account, it's exactly the same. We have the same kind of ledger where we've got two accounts and they got numbers in them. And the one number goes up and the other goes down. But that number, we say those are not connected. In the
Hmm.
bank, they're connected. The one goes up, money goes from one account to the other. And as there is no money, so what does that one going up represent and the other one going down? The one goes up, it's a social relationship. It
Hmm.
means that your claim on the community, even claim is not such a nice word, but you know what I mean. It's like what you can receive from the community
Hmm.
goes up, and the other person's goes down. They might still have a claim, so the claim is reduced, or the obligation increases, or the commitment to give back to the community. So they're not really connected. One count goes up, one goes down. They're not connected except at the social level.
Hmm. Yeah.
So it's your relationship with the community that changes. So when
Hmm.
I give you that bicycle, I'm not getting anything from you in return. I'm just getting an increased claim on the community.
Yeah.
You've received something and I've given you something and I've got some points for giving you something, as it were.
Hmm.
So it's a social thing. It's not just
Yeah.
a money movement thing.
That's something we've
That's
talked
what
about a
makes
lot.
it
Yeah.
live, you see.
Yeah, but one thing that has come up in meetings is this thing of people saying, I didn't think I had this ability, or I didn't think I had this thing to offer, but then someone said, I'm interested, and my first two trades. The first one was, and it probably sounds a bit middle class, someone had to do a piece of writing on a web page for their work, for their profession. It was just something they had to do to move forward. And they had a phobia of writing. They didn't want someone to edit it. They had a phobia of actually looking at it. And that's
Mm.
not something you can advertise. You don't, that's not something a professional editor walks in the room and says, thank you, I'm going. The second thing I did was reaching out to a man with Down syndrome who has early signs of dementia, and he'd gone into himself. Now, one of my closest friends has Down syndrome and dementia. So it's just something that I have experience with, and it's something I could help with. These are not two things that I traded. These are people met me and said, you can do this. I thought,
Mm.
and everyone's saying that. That's wonderful as well. It's almost like recycling. It's almost like, the scraps aren't wasted in society, so to speak. Your trash goes on my mantelpiece. And that is, I think that side is wonderful.
Mm.
And lastly, coming towards the end, I think this is going very well. This Things take a long time to grow, and I feel sometimes maybe in 1,000 years someone will look at this interview the way that finding an old recording with Babbage saying he's invented an adding machine, and he thinks there might be an application for it. There's something down the line might grow. Um, but at the risk of sounding grim, 70 years and 10, where do you see your future now, having achieved all these things?
Well, I don't think in terms of an end. I just want to see this thing come to fruition. To have you you realize the dream. That
Mm,
this thing spreads over the earth, I'm not. I don't see it competitively. I don't
mm,
say, oh, well, run down the money system. It's there. We know its problems. No use spending your life pointing out its weaknesses and its faults, because we know that, and plenty of books have been written about it. The idea is really just to promote this idea that you can trade without money, and money should really just be a measure,
mm,
a unit of measure. It's a bit like a kilometer or a kilogram.
yeah,
There's no quantity of
yeah,
kilograms or kilometers. They're just units of measure, and same with our currencies, whatever we call them. Here in Cape Town, we call them talents. A talent is not a quantity of anything; it's a
mm,
measure of value.
mm,
So if I say I've got a balance of 3,000 talents, that means the value that I've created is 3,000 points above
mm,
what zero. But if you look at the total amount that I've traded over the years, which is hundreds of thousands, that doesn't represent coins. It's like what you've given and what you've received. It's the measure of energy, measure of value.
mm,
And that's a difficult thing for a lot of people to get out of this mode of counting coins or seeing things in terms of number of coins, how much
mm,
money you've got in the bank. So those numbers shouldn't represent
mm,
quantity of anything apart from what you've given and what you've received.
mm.
So it's your measure, it's your social standing. It's like,
Yeah.
well, I don't like to use the word social credit because that's something they use in China to measure
Mm,
your position in society. But
mm,
that's the point I'm trying to make, is that the numbers represent your giving, or your participation in the
mm,
society, what you provided and what you received.
yeah.
I think that's the challenge, is to get across that idea.
Mm,
We're not counting coins.
yeah. And again, coming to the end, I said your life, reading about you and your life and all these strands, all these
Mm.
philosophies, it goes off like an octopus, as I say. But there is a through line through, I
Yes.
mean, brilliant technical innovations, um, innovations in your political activism, in social theory, in economics, and then just these other parts of your life,
Mm.
the tradecraft of being in the ANC or the prison escape, all those aspects that But there's a through line which is an approach to sorting problems, a belief in communication, a belief in simple communication that works. And if the system doesn't work, if people can't use it, it won't work.
Mm.
And it kind of goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. This isn't necessarily about race, and it isn't necessarily about nationalism or poverty or religion. There is a social inequality, and it's about how do we overcome that. And as you said, partly the blame is the money system, but it's also what the money system has sidelined, which is our value as human beings. What having an ability that we can give to the world that someone can utilize. And, and it's kind of, to me, it's not like you've done all these different things. It's the same through line, that this is your work with the ANC. This is your work with Vula. It comes
Mm.
through to this point. It's kind of must be satisfying that you can have this kind of resolution in the end, in a sense.
Yeah, the core of the philosophy that I've always used to drive these projects, the same with the escape and with the Vula and with the community exchange system, is that you can't plan this thing up front. That was one of the challenges in the prison. The other prisoners said, just plan this thing out first. Why have you got to do all this stuff? Like, oh, you're making keys all the time. You're just going to get caught and you're going to cause problems for all of us. Just think it out and then do it. I said, it doesn't work like that because you don't know what's beyond the next door, as it were,
Mm.
the next
Yeah,
hurdle. So if you see each door as a hurdle or a barrier, you don't know what's on the other side there.
mm.
How can you plan this thing?
I told you it's a metaphor, isn't
No
it?
idea. The same with the Vola thing. You're faced with a challenge. How do we communicate? Let's try this. Oh, it doesn't work. Let's try that. Oh, that works. And you just build it up into a system, and eventually, through practice, it you end up with something. And keep it as simple as possible. Not go. Make your keys out of wood. Don't try and smuggle in a welding system or
Yeah,
a chainsaw or something.
small, practical, discrete systems,
All
user friendly.
practical and step by step. Be
Yeah.
patient, show a lot of patience, just keep plodding on and use your experience to move to the next step. You don't know what's the next step. We have these regular meetings about what to do with the new version of CES, and sometimes I shake my head and say, well, we don't really know. Let's just
Mm.
start building something. Let's not plan this whole thing before we even start.
Mm.
And that's the challenge is many people just want to have it all worked out,
Yeah.
step by step by step by step before
Has to
we
has to
even
be
build.
has to be organic and evolve.
Organic,
Yeah.
just start building. If it doesn't work, well, then change it
Mm.
until it does work.
Yeah. You
That's my
can't
approach to
and you
thinking.
can't plan too much because people have got to work with it, and it comes down to people, human nature.
You really don't understand how people are gonna take to it.
Mm.
You can imagine it. You just don't know. Okay.
Okay. Well, Tim Jenkin, thank you for your work. Thank you for your patience. I think you're the man who weaponized patience, we can say, over your looking at your career. Yeah, definitely. And thank you for your time. Thank you very much.